If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. So for whatever reason a master wanted to send away his concubine, he has to let her be redeemed. As I said before, the price he paid, the dowry he paid for her, was associated with her purity and innocence. So that if he took that purity and innocence, if he humbled her, if he took her virginity, I think he could not redeem her for money. So he could return her back to her family. But if he had not slept with her at that point, it might be that he could expect a return of payment for her, for returning her, because he decided he didn't want her. But if he had slept with her and he wanted to send her away, he had to return her to the family, or let her go free if she had no family, without the expectation of a return on the payment he made, because he has humbled her. And I'm conjoining this teaching here with Deuteronomy 21 when I make that conclusion. The next part of the verse, he shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. Now, the way this verse is phrased, I think, is poorly translated, and I have read so many commentaries on this that all conclude the wrong thing. They conclude that this verse, what it's communicating is that he has no right to sell her to a foreign people because he's broken faith with her. And they interpret the broken faith with her as being just by sending her away. And because he sent her away and never ended up marrying her, that's him breaking faith with her. And therefore, he can't send her to sell her to a foreign people. But that is not even consistent with any other part of Scripture, because a man was never allowed to sell a concubine or anybody to a foreign people, especially not a Hebrew Israelite, which is what this entire passage is about. It's about Hebrew slaves. God said, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You are not to be subject as slaves to a foreign people. They were to be kept in-house, in Israel. And here, the Bible's saying, you shall not sell her to a foreign people. But some interpreters and commentators will say, well, he has no right to sell her to a foreign people because he's broken faith with her. Well, the contrapositive of that would be that he could sell her to a foreign people if he didn't break faith with her, which makes no sense. If he was faithful to her, if he was treating her right and good, you're saying that that means that he then has the right to sell her to a foreign people? That makes no sense. I looked up the original Hebrew of this. A lot of the meaning of this verse changes when you add certain punctuations in certain places. Punctuation changes the entire meaning of the sentence, and there was no punctuation in the original manuscripts to change the meaning as we're translating them. So it's something that we kind of put into the English translation to help us understand what the text is saying, but it wasn't in the original Hebrew of the manuscripts. And if you take that punctuation out and read what the literal English is from a interlinear Bible of Hebrew and English, it reads more like this. To sell her to a foreign people, he shall have no right in dealing treacherously with her. Do you see how that completely changes the meaning, or how it sounds? What it's saying is, if he does send her to a foreign people, that would be dealing treacherously with her. Now that is consistent with the rest of Scripture. We don't want to be giving our women over as slaves to foreigners. When she's subject as a slave to foreign people, they have rules that are not protecting her, that are not entitling her, that are not holding her up in high regard. That's what I think this verse is saying right here. It's not saying he's broken faith with her by sending her away, therefore he's not allowed to sell her to a foreign people. No, it would be selling her to a foreign people. That would be breaking faith with her. That would be dealing treacherously with her. Okay, moving on. Verse 9, if he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. Now, there's a popular understanding that this verse 10 is speaking on a context that is a resultant context from verse 9. In other words, what they think it means is that if he designates his concubine to his son, then deals with her as a daughter. And if he himself takes another concubine, as opposed to the one that he gave to his son, then he shall not diminish the one he gave to his son, her clothing, her food, or her marital rights. Now, I don't think that is accurate to the text, because to say that verse 10 is a resultant context of verse 9 is a bit of cherry picking, because verse 9 isn't a resultant context of verse 8, and that's also a conditional of if she does not please her master, because in verse 8, he sends the woman away. So if he sends the woman away in verse 8, he can't then in verse 9 designate her for a son. So verse 9 is not a resultant context of verse 8. It's just speaking on two different contexts, on what to do in these two different situations. They're not causally connected to each other. And so I think they would, in order to be consistent, the same has to apply between verse 9 and 10. They are not resultant contexts of each other. These are just two different situations, and how to deal with them. They're not causally connected to each other. The other reason to believe that verse 10 is not a resultant context of verse 9 is because if he gave the concubine to his son, that would mean she is designated for his son. Verse 9, if he designates her for his son. And if she's designated by contract, that doesn't make any sense because she's designated not to the father, but she's designated to the son. If the father doesn't provide this, she's allowed to leave the son? No, she's designated to the son by concubinal contract, not to the father. So that's another reason why it doesn't make any sense for verse 10 to be a resultant context of verse 9. I think these verses are all speaking non-causally connected to each other on different situations on how to deal with a concubine. Okay? So in other words, if he takes another woman to himself, meaning in addition to the woman he already has, then he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. That is, the first woman is still entitled to the same things of her contract that she had before he took a second woman. That's what it's saying. And that makes more sense in that context. It doesn't make sense that a man takes a concubine to himself, gives another concubine to his son, and now he's obligated to provide for both these women, even though he only has one designated to himself. The son certainly had the ability, if he has the ability to take on a concubine, he certainly has the ability to earn and work and provide for that concubine. If he's old enough to have a concubine, he's definitely old enough to be a provider, as per the father's judgment. Okay, that man, as he provides food, clothing, and marital rights to his concubines, they all are entitled to it. And if they do not get those three things, if they are not provided for, that is when a concubine has the right, in verse 11, to go out for nothing without payment of money. She has the right to leave, and to leave without redemption of payment to the man for what he paid for. And it doesn't give any indication in verse 11 if she has had sex with him or not at this point. So whether he's had sex with her or not, if he cannot provide, he does not get a redemption on his payment for her. So this is also an example of how a concubine is not a wife, because here the law is providing to her a way of getting out of concubinage, an entitlement of getting out of concubinage, without the need for the man to send her off, but she can expire her own contract and leave. And it's not considered a divorce or breaking of a marriage covenant. It's not a sin. It's provided for her here in the law in verse 11. Now, I want to just focus on, to end up this whole passage, is in verse 10, that word marital rights. That word in the English in verse 10 that says marital rights, again, I think it's misappropriating what marriage is to an actual concubine situation. So it shouldn't say marital rights, it should say concubinal rights. So she has concubinal rights that the man is not allowed to diminish in providing to her. Now, it's whatever the rights were in her concubine contract, but are there something specific in concubinal rights in this word? There's a little bit of wiggle room for debate on what it actually means, because this is the only time in the Hebrew Bible where that word is used. It's Strong's Concordance 5772 if you'd like to look it up. But keep in mind everything I've already conjectured about what the biblical translators are pressured into doing. They'll try to associate it with being marital rights when this is in fact talking of a concubine. It's concubinal rights. Since the word concubine comes from roots that literally mean cohabitate, to live with, and the word in the Hebrew is weonata, which is associated with other Hebrew words that mean to dwell with or to dwell in. So it literally means concubinal rights. I think the specific association with this word is communicating a dwelling, to live with indwelling, right? So he's to provide to her food, clothing, and a dwelling place and shelter. That's what I think it means. There's a little bit of wiggle room as to what more specifically you think it might mean, but I think that's the best explanation. But the point being, it's not marital rights, it's concubinal rights. And it's because of these rights that she was entitled to that makes her position as a concubine actually pretty comfortable. Pretty comfortable because she was involved with the decision with her father on who she would be assigned to, who she would be designated to. And once making that decision, she has provided to her family financial support in this transaction that she was involved with in making. And she goes into a lifestyle of being provided for. Food, clothing, shelter, or concubinal rights that she can expire, that she can end if she sees any diminishment of such support given to her and under the terms of the specific contract that she had in her designation to this man. So that's far from being an oppressive position. Out of all the texts we've already looked at, it was actually what I would call a pretty Cush lifestyle. It was a Cush concubine role. For some reason, there is an idea in modern society that concubines are shameful because it was so oppressive to be in that position. And everything we've gone over so far says quite the opposite. It says quite the opposite. And when it did become oppressive, if it did become oppressive, that was a scandal because it wasn't supposed to be that way. Yeah, that's the point I'm trying to make in these verses as you look at them and you make an overall total approach to the scripture. It flies in the face of every idea that modern Western society has about what a concubine was in Israel.